Police, open the door now. Oh, stop. What are you doing? I said open it. Please don't break it. Last chance. Help. Please open up now. No, don't break it. Hands where I can see them. Okay, I didn't do anything. Stay right there, don't move. Please, I swear.
The first mistake Officer Bryce Callahan made was assuming the house was ordinary. The second was kicking in the door. It was a quiet suburban street, trim lawn, beige siding, a brass plaque beside the entrance most people would never read twice. Inside, Ryan Fletcher stood at the window, breathing steady, eyes locked on the officer outside. He was not afraid. He was calculating. Callahan shouted another command and wedged metal into the doorframe. He thought he was about to uncover something illegal. He was right, just not in the way he thought, because the man inside was not hiding from the law. He was the law, just not Callahan's version of it. And the moment the door splintered, a silent alert activated. One that did not call local backup. It called Washington. This quiet street would belong to people Callahan did not outrank. This was not a break-in. It was a career-ending misunderstanding. Hit subscribe now and see how one split-second decision turns into a career-ending reckoning. Because this door was not the only thing about to break. The house on Willow Drive looked like every other house on the block. That was the point. Ryan Fletcher stood at the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee that had gone cold. He had not touched it since. His eyes moved in a slow, practiced sweep. Window, door, monitor, window. The kind of rhythm that did not come from training manuals. It came from years of standing in rooms that looked safe, but were not. The safe house had been active, a stretch of controlled silence, of grocery runs timed to avoid patterns, of blinds adjusted to the exact angle that allowed outward visibility without inviting it back. The neighbors, if they noticed anything at all, saw a quiet man who kept to himself. Maybe a remote worker, maybe recently divorced. People filled in the blanks with whatever made them comfortable. Ryan let them. His official designation was Protective Intelligence Officer, GS-13. Assigned to the Federal Witness Security Support Division, a unit most people in law enforcement had never heard of, which was exactly how the division preferred it. His job was not to chase criminals. It was not to make arrests or build cases or testify in courtrooms. His job was simpler and more absolute than any of that. Keep the asset alive until extraction. The asset was a man in his 50s named Edward Thorpe, currently occupying the reinforced basement 2 floors below Ryan's feet. Thorpe had spent years managing financial records for an East Coast organized crime network before deciding quietly and with great personal risk that he no longer wanted to. And his testimony was the centerpiece of a federal prosecution that had taken years to build. Several previous witnesses had disappeared before trial. Thorpe was not going to be the next. Ryan had been briefed on the case in a windowless room at a field office he was not allowed to name. He had read the threat assessment twice, memorized the extraction protocol, and asked exactly 2 questions before accepting the assignment. He was not the type to ask more than he needed. The house itself was a masterpiece of institutional deception. From the street, it was indistinguishable from the beige vinyl-sided homes flanking it on either side. The same modest porch, the same trim lawn maintained by a contractor who believed he was working for a property management company. Inside, the walls held more than drywall as encrypted communication relays ran behind the baseboards. Motion sensors covered every entry point. A silent alert system, hardwired, not wireless, not hackable by anything short of a direct power cut, sat dormant beneath the front threshold, waiting. There was a brass plaque beside the front door. Small, understated, the kind of thing a person's eyes slid past without registering. It bore a federal designation code and a single line of fine print that carried the legal weight of a loaded weapon. Ryan had read it the first morning. He had not needed to read it again. He set the cold coffee down and moved to the front window, standing to the left of the frame the way he always did, visible enough to monitor the street, angled enough to avoid silhouetting himself against the interior light. Willow Drive was quiet. A woman walked a terrier past the hydrant on the corner. A teenager on a bicycle cut across the intersection without stopping. 2 houses down, someone was mowing a lawn. The mechanical drone of it steady and unremarkable. Normal. Ryan had learned not to trust normal. Extraction was scheduled. A federal transport team would arrive in an unmarked vehicle. Thorpe would be moved undercover, and this house would be quietly decommissioned, swept, sanitized, and returned to the property rotation. Ryan would file his final report, take some mandatory downtime, and wait for the next assignment. He had held positions longer than that in conditions far less comfortable. He could hold this one. He turned from the window and moved back through the kitchen, his footsteps deliberate and quiet on the hardwood floor. Below him, he could hear the faint sound of a television. Thorpe watching the news again, the volume low the way Ryan had asked him to keep it. The man was frightened. He had every right to be, but he was cooperating, and that was what mattered. Ryan refilled the mug, this time with water, and stood at the counter again. Window, door, monitor, window. Outside, Willow Drive stayed quiet for now. Officer Bryce Callahan had been a cop for years, and he had been angry about it, not the job itself. He still believed in the job, or told himself he did, which was not quite the same thing. What he was angry about was the ceiling, the invisible, infuriating ceiling that seemed to exist specifically for men like him. Men who showed up, men who put in the hours, men who did not smile the right way in the right rooms or shake the right hands at the right retirement dinners. Sergeant Callahan, that was what it should have said on his collar by now. Maybe lieutenant. Instead, it still said officer, the same as it had since the beginning, and every morning he pinned that badge on. He felt the word like a splinter he could not reach. The promotion board had passed him over more than once. The first time his supervisor cited interpersonal concerns, a phrase so deliberately vague, it told him everything and nothing. The second time there was no explanation at all, just a name on a list that was not his. A younger guy, less experienced, the kind of guy who knew how to make the brass feel comfortable. Callahan had stopped trying to make anyone feel comfortable a long time ago. He was broad through the shoulders with a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete and eyes that moved fast and assumed faster. His record had commendations in it. Several use of force incidents reviewed and cleared. 2 civilian complaints dismissed. 1 departmental reprimand for failure to de-escalate that he still referred to as a misunderstanding when anyone brought it up. His clearance rate was above average. His temperament was not. And he was parked on the east end of Willow Drive when the call came through. A disturbance complaint, origin unclear, logged by dispatch as a possible domestic or suspicious activity at a residential address mid-block. The details were thin. A neighbor had reported unusual activity and a man watching from the window. That was it. No description of a weapon, no raised voices, no specific threat. Thin enough that most officers would have treated it as a low-priority welfare check. Callahan treated it like a lead. He pulled the cruiser to the curb 2 houses down, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, studying the address. Beige seating, small porch, blinds angled down. Nothing visibly wrong, nothing visibly right either. He had been doing this long enough to know that quiet was not the same as innocent. Quiet was sometimes just careful. He climbed out of the vehicle and adjusted his belt, eyes already moving across the property line. The lawn was too neat, the porch too bare, no shoes by the door, no potted plants, no mail visible in the box. It had the sterile quality of a space being maintained rather than lived in. Callahan filed that away without fully articulating it, the way experienced officers sometimes process details before their conscious mind caught up. He was halfway up the front walk when he saw the man standing at the window, left side of the frame, partially obscured by the angle of the blinds, but visible, watching, not the casual glance of someone checking who had pulled up outside. A steady, deliberate observation, the kind of look that came from someone who had been watching before Callahan even got out of the car. Callahan stopped walking. The man did not move. Something tightened in Callahan's chest. Not fear exactly, but the particular alertness that years of street work had wired into him. He told himself it was instinct. He told himself the man's stillness was suspicious. He told himself a lot of things in the moments they held eye contact through the glass. What he did not tell himself was to slow down. He moved to the porch and knocked hard, the flat of his fist against the door frame. The way he always knocked, not a request, a statement. Police. Open up. Nothing. He knocked again. Harder. Sir, I need you to open this door. I am responding to a disturbance call. Open the door now. The blinds shifted slightly. The man was still there, still watching, still not moving toward the door. Callahan's jaw tightened. He had seen this before, or thought he had. The hesitation, the calculation behind the eyes, the deliberate non-compliance that some people mistook for a right. He reached for his radio with one hand and let the other drop to his belt. He was not leaving without answers, and if the door did not open soon, he was going to stop asking. Ryan heard the knock and did not move toward the door. He had already clocked the cruiser 2 houses down, noted the make, the positioning, the single occupant who sat too long before getting out. Patrol officers on routine welfare checks did not sit. They pulled up, walked up, knocked, and moved on. This one had studied the house first. That told Ryan something about the man before he had even seen his face. Now he stood at the window and watched Officer Callahan on the porch reading him the way he had been trained to read people in high-pressure environments. The tight jaw, the hand that dropped instinctively toward the belt. The knock that was not a knock so much as an announcement of intent. Ryan had encountered men like this before. Not bad men necessarily, but dangerous ones. Men whose authority had become so fused with their identity that any resistance to one felt like an attack on the other. Hombre. He stepped back from the window and pulled out his credentials. The laminated federal ID, the designation card, the emergency contact protocol card with the field office number printed in bold at the bottom. He held them in his left hand and moved toward the door, stopping a couple feet short of it. Officer. His voice was calm, pitched to carry through the door without aggression. I hear you. I am not ignoring you. I need you to listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. A pause from the other side. Open this door. I will cooperate fully, Ryan said, keeping his tone even. But I need to inform you that this is a federally designated property, currently under active protective operation. I am a federal officer. Before this door opens, I need confirmation that you have a warrant, or I need your supervising officer on the line. That is not defiance. That is protocol. The silence that followed was brief. Then Callahan's voice came back harder than before. I do not need a warrant for a disturbance call. Open the door, or I will open it. Ryan closed his eyes briefly, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of watching a situation move toward a cliff in slow motion, while the person driving showed no interest in the brakes. Officer, I am asking you to contact your dispatch and request a jurisdiction check on this address before you take any further action. That one call will clarify everything. It will take just a couple minutes. You have seconds. Ryan pressed his credentials flat against the inside of the door's narrow side window, the small pane of frosted glass beside the frame. He angled the federal ID so the badge seal was visible, the photograph facing out. I am showing you my credentials right now through the side glass. Federal Protective Intelligence. Look at what I am showing you before you make a decision. You cannot walk it back. He heard movement on the porch, a shift of weight. A pause that lasted just long enough for him to think for one moment that the man outside was actually looking. Then Callahan's voice returned, and whatever hesitation had existed in that pause was gone. That could be anything. Fake IDs exist. You have seconds. Ryan straightened. He kept his breathing steady and kept his hands visible. He kept his voice at the same controlled register it had been since the first knock. He was not going to shout. He was not going to threaten. He was not going to give this man a single thing he could point to later as justification. Officer Callahan, he had read the name tag through the window. Using it was deliberate, a reminder that this was a conversation between two specific people with specific consequences attached to their names. I'm asking you one more time. Call your dispatch. Request a federal jurisdiction check on this address. Do that one thing, and this ends without incident for either of us. Another silence, longer this time. Ryan stood perfectly still, credentials in hand, listening to the quality of the quiet on the other side of the door. He had been in enough standoffs, formal and informal, to know the difference between a man reconsidering and a man preparing. The difference was subtle, a shift in breathing, a change in the weight of the silence. What he heard was not reconsideration. He heard the metallic scrape of something being wedged into the doorframe. Ryan took one step back, exhaled slowly, and reached for the emergency trigger panel mounted flush against the interior wall. A matte black rectangle no larger than a light switch that most people would never notice. His thumb hovered over it. The door began to give. The door came in fast. One hard shove after the prior did its work, and the frame gave with a sound like a gunshot. Wood splitting, brass hardware skittering across the entryway tile, the door swinging wide and slamming against the interior wall, hard enough to leave a mark. Callahan came in behind it, one hand on his weapon, eyes sweeping the room with the aggressive efficiency of a man who had already decided what he was walking into. Ryan did not move. He was standing several feet back from the threshold, hands raised to shoulder height, credentials still visible in his left hand, body angled slightly sideways, a posture that communicated both compliance and training. He had not retreated to the back of the house. He had not reached for anything. He was exactly where a man with nothing to hide and everything to protect would stand. His thumb had already pressed the trigger panel. He had done it in the moment before the frame splintered, a single clean depression of the button, no more dramatic than switching off a light. There was no sound, no flashing indicator, no confirmation tone. The system was not designed for theater. It was designed for certainty. Somewhere beneath the walls of this house, a hard-wired signal had already traveled through a dedicated, encrypted line to a federal operations center some distance away, where a duty officer was now reading an alert that contained this address, this asset designation, and a single status code that meant one thing: breach confirmed. Respond immediately. Callahan did not know any of that. He stood in the doorway, chest heaving slightly from the exertion, eyes locked on Ryan, with the focused intensity of a man who had convinced himself he was right. His hand rested on his holster, but had not drawn. Not yet. "Do not move," he said. "Hands where I can see them." "They are already up," Ryan said quietly. "Get on the ground." Ryan did not move. "I am a federal officer. My credentials are in my left hand. I am not getting on the ground. I am not a threat to you, but I need you to understand what you have just done." From below, from the basement, came a sound, a sharp, muffled crash. Something knocked over, then rapid footsteps, the kind that came from a man moving in panic rather than purpose. Edward Thorpe had heard the door come in. Days of controlled tension had just found its breaking point, and whatever composure the man had been holding together had apparently shattered along with the doorframe. Ryan kept his eyes on Callahan and kept his voice level. "There is a protected individual in this building. He is not a threat. He is a federal witness under active protection. If he is harmed or if his identity is compromised because of what is happening right now, that becomes your responsibility." Callahan's eyes moved to the floor, tracking the sound from below. Something shifted in his expression. Not doubt exactly, but a flicker of something that had not been there on the porch. A hairline crack in the certainty. It closed almost immediately. "Who else is in the house?" "I have told you everything you are clear to know at this moment," Ryan said. "The rest requires authorization you do not currently have." Callahan took 2 steps forward, hand tightening on the holster. "That is not how this works." "It is exactly how this works." Ryan's voice did not rise, did not harden. It stayed at the same measured register it had been since the first knock, because he understood something Callahan did not, that the situation was already resolved, not by anything Ryan needed to do, but by what had already been done. The alert was sent. The response was in motion. Every second that passed now was simply time filling the gap between the trigger and the consequence. Ryan did not need to win this argument. He just needed to keep Callahan from doing something that added a second charge to the first. Below, the footsteps had stopped. Thorpe had either found a corner or found his nerve. Either way, the silence from the basement was better than the panic. Callahan moved further into the room, eyes sweeping the walls, the monitors, the communication equipment that no private residence had any business containing. Ryan watched him take it in. The encrypted relay panel, the hardwired alert system, the federal asset tags on the equipment cases stacked near the far wall. He watched him start to understand that something was wrong with his version of events. Not enough to stop him, but enough to plant the first seed of it. Outside, Willow Drive was still quiet. It had a short time left to stay that way. Ryan lowered his hands slowly, deliberately, in the way that communicated control rather than submission. He held the credentials out at arm's length, not thrust forward aggressively, not dangled passively, but extended with the quiet authority of a man who had done this before and understood exactly what the documents in his hand represented. The federal ID, the designation card, the laminated authorization sheet bearing 2 department seals, and a classification marker that most local law enforcement would never encounter in an entire career. "Look at what I'm showing you," Ryan said. "Take your time. Read it." Callahan glanced at the ID the way a man glances at something he has already decided is irrelevant. A flicker of the eyes, a dismissive tilt of the chin. He did not reach for it. did not lean in, did not give it the time it would have taken to change the entire trajectory of the next hour of his life. "I have seen fake federal IDs before," he said. "Have you seen that seal before?" Ryan kept his voice neutral. "That is not a design you can pull off a template. Call it in. Read the designation number on the bottom right corner into your dispatch radio and wait for the response. That is all I am asking." Callahan's jaw tightened. "You do not get to tell me what to do in an active investigation. This is not your investigation." Ryan said it without heat, without edge, as a simple statement of fact. "This property falls outside your jurisdiction. It has since the federal designation was filed. Whatever call brought you here, whatever you think you walked into, you are standing inside a classified federal operation. And every decision you make from this point forward is being made inside that context. Whether you acknowledge it or not, something moved behind Callahan's eyes. Not belief, not yet, but the first uncomfortable awareness that the ground beneath his certainty was not as solid as it had felt on the porch. He covered it the way men like him always covered uncertainty, with escalation. He unnapped his holster. "I'm going to need you to get on the ground. Last time I am asking." Ryan looked at the holster, looked back at Callahan's face, ran a rapid internal calculation. Threat level, response timeline, Thorpe's status below, the distance between himself and the nearest hardcover. He had been in rooms with drawn weapons before. He had been in rooms with men far more dangerous than Bryce Callahan. What he felt was not fear, it was the specific focus clarity that came from training intersecting with a live situation. He did not get on the ground. "Unnapping that holster is a mistake," Ryan said quietly. "Not because of me, because of who has already been notified and how they are going to interpret the scene when they arrive. You want to be the officer who responded to a call and asked questions, or the officer who drew on a federal agent inside a classified safe house. Those are two very different reports." Callahan took another step forward on the ground now, some distance away in a federal operations center that existed on no public directory. A duty officer had already escalated the alert to priority status. The breach code from Willow Drive had come in clean. Hardwired signal, no interference. Timestamp confirmed. She had cross-referenced the asset designation, pulled the active operation file, and had a supervisor on the line in moments. The supervisor had made 2 calls. The first was to a tactical response coordinator. The second was to the special agent in charge of the interagency task force that owned the Thorpe operation. Both calls ended the same way. "Move now." In a staging area not far from Willow Drive, 3 unmarked vehicles that had been on standby rotation since the operation went active were already running. The tactical team inside them did not need a briefing. They had read the operation file on day 1. They knew the address, the asset, the layout, the protocol. They knew what a breach code meant and what their response to it looked like. They were already moving. Back inside the house, Callahan had closed the distance, and his hand was now wrapped around the grip of his weapon. Though it remained holstered, his breathing had changed. Faster, shallower, the rhythm of a man running on adrenaline and ego in equal measure. Ryan stood his ground and said nothing more. There was nothing left to say that would reach this man in time. The argument was over. What was coming next was not an argument. Outside, at the far end of Willow Drive, a black SUV turned slowly onto the street and cut its headlights. The first SUV stopped at the north end of Willow Drive without a sound. No sirens, no lights, no radio chatter bleeding into the open air. The vehicle simply arrived the way federal response always arrived when the situation was serious enough, quietly, completely, and with the kind of coordinated precision that made local law enforcement look like it was still learning the alphabet. 2 more vehicles came in from the south end simultaneously, spacing themselves with the practiced geometry of a team that had run this drill enough times that it no longer felt like a drill. 6 doors opened, 8 personnel deployed. They moved without urgency and without hesitation, which was somehow more unsettling than either. Urgency could be read as panic. Hesitation could be read as uncertainty. What these people projected was neither. It was the flat, absolute competence of individuals who had already assessed the situation from the staging area and arrived with the outcome already determined in their minds. They wore tactical vests over plain clothes, no visible department markings, weapons holstered but accessible. 2 of them moved immediately to the neighboring properties, positioning at angles that covered the side approaches to the safe house. 2 more took the rear. The remaining 4 established a perimeter at the front, sealing the porch approach with the quiet efficiency of people closing a door. Willow Drive was no longer a public street. It had become a federal envelope, and everything inside it now operated under a different set of rules. Inside the house, Ryan heard them before he saw them, not footsteps. The team was too disciplined for that. What he heard was the particular quality of silence that descended when trained personnel locked down a perimeter. The ambient noise of the street, the distant lawnmower, the occasional passing car simply stopped registering. The world outside the windows had changed its texture. He allowed himself one slow breath. Callahan heard something too. He had been mid-sentence, another command, another demand for compliance, when his own words seemed to lose their momentum. His eyes cut to the front window. Through the angled blinds, the shape of the first SUV was visible at the end of the block, then the second. Then the movement of figures along the property line that did not match anything a routine backup call produced. He stopped talking. Ryan watched him process it. He watched the sequence move across the man's face in real time. Confusion first, then a reaching for explanation. Then, the moment the explanation failed to arrive and something colder moved in to replace it. Callahan was experienced enough to recognize a tactical deployment. He had seen SWAT setups before. He knew what coordinated perimeter coverage looked like. What he did not have a framework for was the scale of it, the speed of it, the complete absence of any communication with his own department. No one had called him. No sergeant had radioed to ask what was happening on Willow Drive. No dispatch had flagged an incoming federal response. The operation around him had materialized without touching his chain of command at all, which meant it existed in an entirely separate chain. One that had not felt the need to notify him, because notifying him was not part of the protocol. He was not a colleague in this situation. He was the situation. "What is this?" Callahan said. It came out flat. Not quite a question. Ryan did not answer immediately. He moved to the window, staying to the left of the frame, out of long habit, and looked out at the street. He could see 2 of the tactical personnel from this angle, still positioned, watching the house with the patient attention of people who were in no hurry, because hurry was no longer necessary. This, Ryan said, is what a federal response to a safe house breach looks like. Callahan's hand had moved away from his holster without him appearing to notice. A small thing, significant. The body sometimes understood the shift in power before the mind was willing to accept it. He looked at the equipment on the walls again, the relay panels, the hardwired systems, the asset cases. He looked at Ryan, really looked maybe for the first time since he had come through the door, and something in the architecture of his certainty began to show its cracks. "I responded to a call," he said. The words had a different quality now, less declaration, more construction, the early framing of a defense. "I know," Ryan said. He said it without satisfaction, without edge, the way you acknowledged a fact that did not change anything. Outside, a 4th vehicle had positioned itself at the intersection. The block was sealed, and Bryce Callahan was standing in the middle of it. Callahan's radio crackled. His own dispatch, finally catching up to what was happening on Willow Drive, came through in broken fragments. A supervisor's voice asking for a status update, the tone already carrying the particular strain of someone who had just received a phone call they were not expecting. Callahan did not answer it. He stood in the middle of the room with the radio on his hip and let it crackle into silence, his eyes moving between Ryan and the window with the restless energy of a man whose options were visibly narrowing, but who had not yet accepted the narrowing. "This is a setup," he said. "Someone is setting me up." Ryan said nothing. "I responded to a legitimate call. I identified suspicious activity. I made entry based on probable cause. Bryce." Ryan used the first name deliberately, the same way he had used the last name on the porch, not to diminish, to ground, to pull the man back from the abstract into the specific personal reality of where he was standing. "Stop building the argument. There is no one in this room to convince." Callahan's eyes snapped to him. "Do not tell me what to do. I am telling you what I see. I see a man who made a series of decisions that brought him to this room, and I see him trying to reframe those decisions in real time because the room looks different than he expected. That is understandable. But the people outside that door are not interested in the reframe. They are interested in the breach." Something ignited behind Callahan's eyes, the particular fury of a man who recognized the truth in what he was hearing and hated the person saying it for that exact reason. His chest expanded, his shoulders came up. Years of frustration and passed over promotions and civilian complaints dismissed and departmental reprimands filed, all of it compressed into this moment. This room, this federal officer standing several feet away, telling him with quiet certainty that he had made a catastrophic mistake. "You do not know anything about me," Callahan said. "I know enough," Ryan said, "and none of it matters right now." Callahan took a step forward, then another. His hand came up from his side, not reaching for the holster, not yet, but moving toward it with the slow, pressurized momentum of a man who had run out of words and was reaching for the only language he had left. The front window exploded with red, not glass, light. 4 distinct laser points appeared on Callahan's chest simultaneously, perfectly spaced, perfectly steady. The kind of grouping that did not happen by accident and was not meant to be subtle. They sat center mass on his tactical vest and did not waver, did not drift, did not blink. They simply existed with the absolute patience of people who had been trained to hold a sight picture indefinitely and who felt nothing about doing so. Callahan froze. His hand stopped moving. The radio on his hip crackled again and went unanswered again, and the sound of it was almost absurd against the silence that had descended over everything else. Outside, nothing moved. The tactical personnel on the perimeter had not shifted position, had not raised their voices, had not announced themselves with the theatrical commands of a standard law enforcement operation. They had simply acquired the target and made their presence known in the only language that required no interpretation. 4 red dots, center mass. Do not. Ryan stood completely still and watched the transformation happen in real time. It was not dramatic. It was not the collapse of a villain in a story where the villain knew they were won. It was quieter and more human than that. The slow physical deflation of a man whose body finally received the message his mind had been refusing. Callahan's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, his jaw unclenched by degrees. His hand, still hovering near the holster, completed its movement, but downward away, fingers spreading open at his side. He looked at the laser dots on his chest. He looked at Ryan. "Tell them to stand down," he said. His voice had changed completely. The command structure was gone. What remained was something raw and smaller. "They will stand down when you give them a reason to," Ryan said, both hands visible. "Step back from the holster. Do not reach for anything." A long moment passed. Then Bryce Callahan raised both hands. It was a simple gesture, practiced even. He had given this instruction to other people hundreds of times over the years. He knew exactly what it meant to comply. He had just never expected to be the one doing it. The laser dot stayed on his chest, steady, patient, absolute. The climax was not an explosion. It was 4 points of red light and one man finally running out of road. She came through the door the way the whole operation had arrived, quietly and with complete authority. Special Agent Nora Bennett was not what Callahan would have pictured. If he had had time to picture anything, mid-40s, medium height, dark hair, pulled back with the functional indifference of someone who had stopped thinking about it years ago. She wore a plain jacket over a tactical vest, a federal credentials case already open in her hand, and the expression of a person who had been called away from something important to deal with something avoidable. She did not raise her voice when she entered. She did not have to. The room reorganized itself around her presence, the way rooms did when the person with the most authority walked in. 2 personnel followed her inside and positioned themselves without being directed, and the laser dots on Callahan's chest disappeared. He was no longer a threat requiring active suppression. He was a problem requiring processing, which was a different category entirely, and somehow less dignified. Bennett looked at Ryan first, a single glance that carried an entire conversation. Status, asset condition, threat assessment, current situation. Ryan gave her a small nod. She returned it and turned to Callahan. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, not for effect. She was reading him the same way Ryan had been reading him since the porch, cataloging, assessing, filing. Then she held up her credentials and gave him the time to look at them that he had not given Ryan. Special Agent Nora Bennett, Federal Interagency Task Force, Witness Security Division. I am the case agent on the operation you just walked into. She closed the credentials case and put it away. I am going to explain what this is. I would recommend you listen carefully because what I tell you in the next few minutes is going to determine the shape of the rest of your career. Always. What is left of it? Callahan said nothing. His hands were still partially raised, a posture he had not fully abandoned even after the laser dots disappeared. He looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. The room had simply stopped belonging to him, and his body knew it. Bennett moved to the center of the room and spoke with the flat, precise cadence of someone delivering a briefing rather than a confrontation. This property, she told him, had been federally designated as a protected safe house asset under an interagency witness security protocol. The designation was filed with the Department of Justice, registered with the relevant federal district, and flagged in the National Law Enforcement Database under a restricted access code that any officer could have queried before making entry. The brass plaque beside the front door bore a federal designation number that, had it been run through any standard law enforcement database, would have returned a federal jurisdiction flag and an immediate instruction to contact the task force duty line before proceeding. None of that had happened. The man currently in the basement, she continued, was a protected federal witness whose testimony was central to an active prosecution involving organized financial crime. His identity, his location, and his existence in this house were classified at a level that Callahan did not have clearance to access. The fact that Callahan now knew this address, had physically entered the property, and had potentially been observed doing so by anyone on the street, meant that the safe house was compromised. The witness would need to be moved. The extraction timeline had been accelerated. The operation had been disrupted by a noise complaint, by a door that did not need to be opened. Bennett let that sit for a moment before she continued. The charges, she said, were being reviewed by the task force legal counsel in real time. Unlawful entry into a federally designated property, interference with a federal protective operation, obstruction of a classified witness security program, each carried federal weight, each would be pursued. The question of whether additional charges applied, including the moment Callahan's hand had moved toward his holster in the presence of a federal officer, was still being assessed. Callahan's face had gone through several changes during this. The defensive architecture he had been constructing since the moment the SUVs appeared had not survived contact with the specifics. Each sentence Bennett delivered removed another load-bearing wall. By the time she finished, what remained on his face was not anger or defiance or the bruised pride of a man passed over for promotion. It was the pale, stripped expression of someone finally understanding the full weight of what he had done. He opened his mouth once, closed it. Bennett watched him with the patient clinical attention of someone who had seen this moment before and felt nothing particular about seeing it again. "Do you have any questions?" she said, "that are not about how to undo this?" He did not answer because they both already knew there was no answer to that one. The police chief arrived after the perimeter was established. His name was Chief Warren Hayes, and he came alone, which told Ryan everything about how the phone call from the task force had gone. No department vehicles flanking him, no public affairs officer, no union representative trailing at a careful distance, just Hayes in a dark overcoat stepping out of an unmarked sedan with the measured composure of a man who had spent the drive over, deciding exactly how he was going to carry himself. Through the next hour, he was led through the perimeter without ceremony. One of the tactical personnel walked him to the door and stepped aside. Hayes paused at the threshold, looked at the splinter door frame, and said nothing. He stepped over the debris and into the house. He looked at Bennett first, then at Ryan, then at Callahan. Whatever he saw in Callahan's face confirmed what the phone call had already told him. Bennett gave him a brief professional acknowledgement and stepped back, ceding the immediate space without ceding authority. This part, she understood, belonged to Hayes. Not because the department had jurisdiction here. It did not. Not anymore, but because there was a human dimension to what came next that federal procedure did not cover and did not need to. Some things required a chain of command to close itself. Hayes crossed the room and stood in front of Callahan. He did not raise his voice. He did not deliver a speech. He was not a man who performed his authority, which was perhaps why he had it in a way Callahan never had. He simply looked at his officer for a long moment, with the expression of a man absorbing a disappointment he could not entirely say he had not seen coming. "Bryce," he said quietly. Callahan's jaw worked. For a moment, it seemed like he might try again, might reach for the argument he had been assembling and dismantling all evening, might find some version of events that still left him standing on solid ground. The habit of self-justification ran deep in men like him. It had been the operating system for years. But Hayes's eyes did not give him anywhere to go with it. "Your badge," Hayes said, "and your weapon." The room was very quiet. Callahan reached up with his right hand and unclipped the badge from his chest. He held it for just a moment, not dramatically, not with any visible ceremony, but with the brief, involuntary pause of a man holding something he had carried so long it had become part of his physical sense of himself. Then he placed it in Hayes' open hand. The weapon came next. He unholstered it with practiced mechanical efficiency, cleared it, and handed it over. Grip first. His face had settled into something flat and unreadable, the expression of a man who had moved past the stages of grief that involved feeling and arrived at the one that involved simply enduring. Hayes took both items and held them without looking at them. "I will be in contact with your attorney," he said, then quieter, almost to himself as much as to Callahan. "You had options. At every point you had options." He did not wait for a response. He turned, exchanged a brief word with Bennett, and walked back out through the broken doorway into the night as two federal personnel moved to Callahan's sides without being asked. Not rough, not theatrical. They simply positioned themselves in the way that made the next step clear, and Callahan, who had run out of resistance somewhere between the laser dots and the charges, walked with them toward the door without being told twice. He did not look at Ryan on the way out. Ryan watched him go. Below, the sound of careful movement indicated that Bennett's team had made contact with Thorpe and begun the extraction protocol. The accelerated timeline was already in motion. A different vehicle, a different route, a different safe house that Callahan would never know the address of. The operation had been disrupted but not destroyed. The testimony would still be given. The prosecution would still proceed. The thing Callahan had stumbled into trying to unravel had survived him, which was the point of building it the way they had. Ryan stood in the middle of the room and listened to the house settle around him. The monitors still glowed. The equipment still hummed. The brass plaque beside the broken door still said exactly what it had always said in the same small print that no one had bothered to read. Outside, the federal vehicles began to quietly withdraw. No sirens on the way out. No announcement, just the gradual return of an ordinary street to its ordinary silence. And somewhere in the back of a federal vehicle moving through it, a man who had mistaken a door for an opportunity finally understood what he had actually broken. Bryce Callahan walked into that house believing he was the most powerful person on the street. He walked out in federal custody. No headlines, no press conference, no dramatic courtroom moment, just a badge on a table, a weapon surrendered grip first, and a career that ended the same way it had always operated without enough patience to ask the right questions before it was too late. Ryan Fletcher never raised his voice, never drew a weapon, never needed to, because discipline in the end is its own kind of power, and the law, the real law, the kind that does not need to announce itself, was always going to win this one. Edward Thorpe was extracted safely. His testimony was delivered. The prosecution moved forward. Willow Drive went quiet again, and somewhere in a federal processing facility, while Bryce Callahan sat with the full weight of one impulsive decision, one door he should never have touched. He had nothing left to do but count the cost. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one that ends up breaking everything that matters. Bryce Callahan thought power came from forcing doors open and demanding answers on his own terms. He believed that hesitation was weakness, and that being right meant never having to slow down or ask the hard questions first. But in that quiet house on Willow Drive, he learned the hardest lesson of all. True strength is not in how loudly you can shout or how quickly you can kick a door down. Real power lives in patience, in discipline, and in the quiet courage to pause long enough to see what is actually in front of you. Ryan Fletcher never raised his voice, never drew his weapon, and never lost control. Yet he stood unshaken because he understood that the strongest law is the one that does not need to announce itself with force. Callahan walked in certain he was in charge and walked out realizing too late that he had shattered his own future. With a single impulsive decision, that moment should remind every one of us. Before you act in anger, before you assume the worst, before you let pride push you past the point of no return, stop and ask yourself, what if I'm wrong? What if there is more to this story than I can see right now? A few seconds of humility can save years of regret. Life has a way of teaching us through the doors we should never have forced open. What about you? Have you ever rushed into a situation only to realize later how much it cost you? Or have you learned the hard way that patience truly is power? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story touched something deep inside you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you real stories about real consequences, quiet strength, and the kind of justice that lingers long after the last red laser dot fades. Don't miss what's coming next. Your support keeps these powerful lessons alive.